Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Literate Conversations. Today we're talking to Emily Race, a teacher from Crawfordsville, Indiana. Hi, Emily. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great. So we are talking about Paul Laurence Dunbar. So tell me again why it was that you chose this writer to talk to me about.
Well, I grew up about 13 miles away from where Paul Laurence Dunbar grew up in Dayton, Ohio. And I worked for 2 summers at the Dayton Aviation Heritage National Historical Park, which commemorates the Wright brothers, Paul Laurence Dunbar, and other Dayton aviation history. So I had read a little bit about Paul Laurence Dunbar as a major figure in Ohio history as like a 4th grader and in my high school, but it wasn't until I really started working at the national park that I came to understand his place in the world of American literature, and my fascination sort of grew from there.
Well, obviously, I think the probably the most well-known poem of his is "Sympathy."
Mm-hmm.
So, what are your thoughts about that poem? Why it's important? Why, for example, Maya Angelou borrowed a line from that poem for her "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings."
And it was another writer who recommended that poem to her. And part of what's interesting to me about Dunbar is the network of writers around him. But in that poem specifically, we see the many layers in a pretty deceptively simple poem. That on the basic level, there's a sort of human experience that we can all relate to, the sense, of being caged or trapped. But the next level down, you can start to see Dunbar's personal experiences, as well as the experiences he sought to portray. And the next layer down is often a sort of scathing social commentary. So One thing to remember about Dunbar is that his parents were both enslaved. His father had escaped slavery and his mother was emancipated. So he is only one generation removed from that. He's growing up in the post-Reconstruction world. He's growing up amid the rise of the Jim Crow laws. So there's a lot going on in his world and in his community and in his family that he really mines in his writing for what does it mean to be free, what is society's obligation toward the individual, and how does that affect the way I interact with others. When he uses the word sympathy, that means I feel the same as. So he's not describing necessarily his own experiences, but the ones that he understands from the way that he's listened growing up in his community and the stories that he's been told. And he understands then why a person in that situation might still sing. And that's an important line, in part because Dunbar's audience would have recognized immediately when you're talking about Black people singing, there's an immediate connect during this time back to slavery, and when slave plantation owners would bring visitors by who were maybe sympathetic toward abolitionists and their cause, they would bring, these people to their plantations and say, look, they're singing in the fields, they're happy. And that was convincing for many people, and that was such a common trope.
Right. Well, there were also coded messages in some of those songs, right? That were part of the slave culture.
And you see that in his antebellum sermon as well, that he's connecting the story of Moses and the escape of the Israelites from Egypt, but then cheekily saying, I'm not talking about this right now, of course. Don't go and tell anyone that I'm sowing dissension, but I'm just saying this is what happened in the Bible. And so saying, it's not a song of joy. Don't be misled. There may be singing, but that's not necessarily why they're singing. It's a plea instead.
Right, cool. And I think that the poem, We Wear the Mask, has a very similar theme to it.
Yeah, you have, again, the layers of a sort of universal experience of how sometimes we perform for the public and we don't expose our whole interior life. and then we can maybe think about how that may have applied to Dunbar in his life. But on the next level down, we're looking at how in his day, Black people in entertainment were mostly represented through minstrel shows, which were white performers wearing blackface and some really grotesque caricatures and putting on an accent and performing in these very racist shows. So when Dunbar is referencing things like performing and masks, it's hard, if you know where he is in time, to not make the connection that he's not just speaking about his personal experiences, but about the portrayal of African Americans and Black Americans at large at the time and what the public sees.
Yeah, I agree. And that actually makes a great transition to the poem, An Antebellum Sermon, which is written in an African American dialect, as other of Dunbar's poems are. And this is a voice that, if you saw it written by a white writer, you would think, oh, that's totally racist, right? It seems like the voice of a minstrel show to us, especially like looking back from 100 years in the future. But it's a different kind of message when that type of voice is used by an African American writer. So I wonder if you can speak to that.
Yeah, this is one of the very complicated parts of Dunbar's legacy. When you say it sounds like the voice of a minstrel show, that's because poems in dialect, in an African American dialect, were not uncommon. They were very popular in Dunbar's time. The problem was they were written by white people, and they were used to perpetuate harmful stereotypes, and they were used as comedy. And so when Dunbar started writing in dialect poems, he himself felt very ambivalently about it, but he was a bit of a novelty to white readers. His dialect poems were way more popular than his poems in standard English, even though they're only a fraction of his output. He wrote novels, he wrote plays, he wrote lyrics for the first all-black musical, he wrote essays, he wrote poems, most of which were in standard English, but the white audience was captivated by the novelty of a black man writing how they imagined black people sounded. And that's something he felt very conflicted about, because on the one hand, it was making him money and making a name for himself. It enabled him to buy a house for his mother while he was living in D.C. And he also spoke to some of his close friends at the time and said, dialect is my first language. He didn't feel like he was putting on a voice, even though he was, when he would speak and he would go on tours reciting his poetry, he was a fantastic orator. Even when he was in high school, his nickname was the Deacon, because he was such a solemn and formal speaker and such a great orator. But for him, personally, he didn't feel that dialect was removed from him. Think about, I mentioned before, his mother, who raised him after his father left, had been an enslaved woman, and she taught herself to read and write so that she could help him. So he was very familiar with the Dayton African American community. He started a newspaper that he hand delivered to them that was called the Dayton Tatler. That was the first newspaper specifically for an African American community. So he's not at a remove from it, but he had a conflicting relationship with those poems. And you see it even how it's published. This is something you don't see when it's in an anthology, but when he published his first volume of poems, Oak and Ivy, all of the standard poems were together under Oak, and the dialect poems were together under Ivy, and there were far fewer of them. And the same thing for volume 2, which was called Majors and Minors. Majors, all of the standard English poems, minors, the dialect poems. So you can see the conflict he even had about that dichotomy and maybe how he viewed it. So he said dialect is my first language, but he was also upset that a lot of what else he had to say got subsumed into a novelty. Because even his dialect poems, they received criticism at the time from white and black writers that they perpetuated a stereotype of African Americans as being pathetic or comic figures.
But if you read those like the Antebellum Sermon, you'll see humor, you'll see humanity, you'll see a wide spectrum of experiences. It's just you have to look past the dialect to see what's actually being said. And I think for a lot of his readers, the novelty of a black man writing in a black dialect overshadowed what he was saying. He was virulently anti-racist. He was virulently anti-slavery. He worshipped
And that's why you see him writing odes to Harriet Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass, which are the last two poems in the section in this anthology.
Yes. I think he took a page out of Frederick Douglass's book in many ways. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person of the 19th century because he saw the implications of what it was like to saturate the market with an alternative view of what people were used to seeing, from, pictures of black men versus minstrel shows. And Dunbar attended his conferences. He followed his career very closely, and he wrote this amazing, amazing elegy about his death and the loss that it was, but what a great life. And those are some of the poems that don't get read as much because I think he gets overshadowed by Frederick Douglass on one end and the Harlem Renaissance on the other. But he's the crucial bridge. Langston Hughes said that Paul Laurence Dunbar was one of his most important writing influences. He said Paul Laurence Dunbar, Carl Sandburg, and Walt Whitman.
I can see that, yeah.
And so that spirit that he had came out a lot in his plays and in his short stories. He got a lot of flack for not writing characters very well in his novels. He also made the very unusual move of writing about white families as characters in some of his novels. So it's not a monolithic legacy that he left behind, but he felt on the one hand that he was speaking authentically, but on the other hand there was a risk that he was sort of, instead of reclaiming the dialect, he was feeding into that concept that people had about what a black voice sounded like, because it was easy to ignore everything else he was writing in favor of that. He wrote a poem that almost never gets anthologized called The Poet, which starts out...
Oh yeah, I've seen that one before. Yeah,
that he sang of love serenely sweet, and love itself was in his lays, and all of these things that he sings about, and then the last two lines are, but the public turned to praise a jingle and a broken tongue, which I think is a heartbreaking line, because on the one hand, it's a tongue that he loves, but on the other hand, he's recognizing how the public is obsessed with consuming it at the expense of some of his other writings. And he never, he died when he was 33. He never came fully to grips with that, I think.
Thanks so much for your time. I think this is a great amount of information for my students to help them with their reading. So thanks again for Zooming with me.
I hope so. Thank you.
All right.
Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.